Good afternoon and a really warm welcome back. I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this panel because building on from this morning's discussions, we're going to hear from some of the social entrepreneurs, but also from Riccardo, which I'm delighted that we've got him on the second panel rather than the first this morning because there was some, delays on the train. But actually, the delays on the train have really helped in terms of the discussion that we're going to have, because social enterprise cities, in the way that we've been talking about, they're not separate entities. Design, regional development is as much about as our MSE, small and medium-sized enterprises, as it is in terms of architecture and design. Friends, colleagues, before I start, I'm going to just do a quick round of introductions and then we'll hear from the 5-minute presentations and then we'll open it up for debate. So firstly, Richard, just introduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Corinne. My name's Richard Brice. I'm founder and head of most things for Clean Slate Solutions. We're a charity. We're based in Middlesbrough, but we cover North Yorkshire and the Teesside area. Our charitable aim is basically to support ex-offenders who are coming out of the justice system, whether that be the prisons or dealing with probation, and find employment for them. So to sort of hassle employers into changing policies and, changing stigma and long-held perceptions with HR people and various things like that. But there's such an appetite for it, and we've been going for 3.5, nearly 4 years now. I was in prison myself, came through on the back of my own journey, decided to set this up, very much David and Goliath at the point of coming out, but my own journey helped me to realise what a good talent pool of people is in prison, and they just needed some support and a leg up, essentially, when they get out. But with knowing that employment is the only real way you're going to get out of poverty, because the DWP are not going to cover the cost of living or whatever that may be, and that leads often back to crime. So, reducing reoffending and helping people put their lives back together is what we do, and mentoring people and loving them and doing all the things that that they're going to need. Not easy, but it's incredible stuff to do.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to come back and pick up a couple of points that you've raised. Stephen, introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Hunt, and I'm founder of Carsis Consulting. My background myself, I'm a researcher, kind of turned practitioner consultant, and that journey has always been around research for impact, or consultancy, or programming for impact. And my reasoning for setting up Carsis was because that journey from research to implementation, and then that learning cycle of organizations implementing change, it can often be very cumbersome, it can be siloing, it can be not holistic. And what we wanted to do is work as knowledge partners with organizations. We work with different governments, we work with foundations, different private sector entities, and bringing those sort of sectors and cross-sector conversations together and facilitate the research and knowledge through to helping those organizations deliver change in a more sort of commercially viable but also socially and environmentally viable way of solving global problems. I think that will do for...
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Tom.
Firstly, thanks for having us here today, and thanks to Sam and Katie from the Enterprise Works team as well for putting together such a great event this afternoon. My name's Tom. I'm the Managing Director and co-founder of Spark, which is a temporary meanwhile use regeneration project based on Piccadilly, just sort of 5 minutes down the road from here. I'm from York and immensely passionate about trying to ensure that York as a changing city, some of the points that were discussed in the first panel there, is, I suppose, represented by local people and people that are passionate about making that regeneration equitable and fair and involves people ultimately, because I think the people that live and work in this city should have a real say in how it changes. I think that's only logical. For our sort of micro example with Spark, we felt that around sort of 2016, when me and Sam got together, who's kindly sat over there, to try and put the project together, the sort of climate at that point was lots of, in our eyes, important cultural venues were closing down. To me, a place only minutes from here. A minute probably is Fibbers, which was on the Stonebow, very important music venue in York. That was closing. The Duchess next door to it, that's subsequently been regenerated and is sat empty, which maybe tells its own story. And yeah, we thought actually, well, what we should do, or what we should channel our energy into doing, is trying to create a new local platform, a new space that can be freely accessible for people's ideas to be born and to flourish and to have a home to grow in a supportive and collaborative environment.
Great, thank you. Riccardo.
Hi, I'm Riccardo. I feel out of place, which is good. As you can tell from my accent, I'm Italian, and that comes with baggage. I was born in a small provincial town in Tuscany called Pistoia, and I realised the older I get, and I'm considerably old, that I have a whole lot of baggage that comes with that. And it's fascinating. What I do, to a certain extent, I hope, as an architect and a planner, I don't create some of the problems that you guys then have to come and resolve. I know that's not true, because people like me do create problems. Because what we do is we get a fee. Architects are, I hope I'm not offending anybody, and I'm in a holy place, I think. Architects are like prostitutes. You give them the fee and they give you a service. I'm actually not a very good architect, because I always give them the service they don't want, because I try and give them the service that I think they need, which creates problems. But normally what happens, you get somebody with a big bag of money comes along and says, I have something, can you make it into something beautiful? Beauty is important, but that's not really what makes place work. And there are symptoms of our society, and this is kind of where do you start and where do you finish, that this debate is about. And what fascinates me is, how did we get here? Because it wasn't like this. It seems to be every decade there's other things that become worse. Yes, and rose-tinted spectacles come into it. You remember your childhood, you remember previous eras as being better. And the world's not a nice place. It's a really hard place. And we as a species are not really nice either. And we make it really difficult. When we get together, we can say a whole of the right things, but the minute we go back to our desks, we revert back to type, and we do what we're paid for. And we need to stop doing that. We need to actually start thinking of the consequences of all our decisions, whether it is to take a flight, and I'm a big culprit in that, or take a car as opposed to walk or cycle, buy specific things. You can actually buy an apple that doesn't look great, but was grown just 10 kilometres from where you are, as opposed to getting one that's really shiny that comes from the other side of the world. So it's about taking responsibility for what we do. And as somebody that deals with, I suppose, the physical side of place, I'm always really interested in the use, the meaning. Place has to have meaning. If it doesn't have meaning, then there's no reason for it being there. We end up with cities like Disneyland, which are frankly not what I think we need or deserve or what I want. But, yeah.
Let me pick up on a couple of those themes, Riccardo, because there's a golden thread between what you've all said. I was really struck by that notion about what makes place work, and I want to come and ask each of you what does make place work. But also, Riccardo, you've been talking about place, but very often, and I love that sort of illustration that you gave between groups like this coming together, having a vision, feeling inspired, going away, and then doing things like we've always done them. So I often use this phrase of at one level, we want to be change agents, and yet at another level, we're the custodians of the status quo. So let me pick up on that first question. What makes place work?
People. People that want to be there. Happy people. People that feel loved. As somebody that works for, some pretty big businesses, when you sit at a meeting, and I've got to go back to investors meeting, and I stand up and I talk about passion, love and things, I just go, what? It's a spreadsheet. Well, the spreadsheet is what creates the problems that we have. I mean, to me, it's as simple as that. I'm dyslexic, I have a difficulty with numbers, and that's not why I don't like spreadsheets, because there's no emotion. There's no emotional response to it. Now, there are some investors, some that I'm working for just now, that have realised that if they can generate an emotional response out of their real estate investments, they make more money. I actually don't care, because if that's the end result, I'm the prostitute, remember? I will do that. And it's about not just saying I design beautiful things. Hopefully the stuff that I'm involved with is beautiful in many different ways. It's the same as the value that I think should be derived out of projects is not monetary. Monetary is important because that's the value system that we have created. There are other values that are far more important to us as a species and our survival as a species, because you're not going to take that bag of money to the next level or whatever. And there's problems with all of that, but we need it. I like nice things, you know, and money gets me there. But that's not what I do for. And I'm lucky that I'm able to. But it's people. If you create a place and there are no people, to me it's very simple. Go to any project and just sit and watch. Do the designers come take a picture and then go and take a coffee somewhere else? Because that's what normally happens. It's shiny, it's brand new, it looks good. I'll take a picture, but I'm just going around the corner. Where is the real place? How do we create real place? Real places take a neighbourhood takes around 300 years to evolve. Just now we have a magic wand, boom, a place happens. And then people just go, it's cold, it's empty.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's really powerful. Richard, I know in our discussions in the past, emotions and place lie at the heart. You know, you talked about your own backstory, and social enterprise is such an important role in communities, in sustaining communities. So tell us about what makes place work for you in relation to a social enterprise. And how have you put the emotions back in? Because I think, Riccardo, you made a really pertinent point. Places aren't rational beings, you know, they're emotional.
Yeah, I think there's just some words that were coming to mind actually as we were talking, and you posed the original question. And I think forgiveness, if we don't have forgiveness somewhere in our hearts, all of us, you're all going to need it at some point in your lives, whether it's your kids, whether it's your parents, whether it's your employer. You're all going to need it at some point. Some need more forgiveness than others, maybe, but forgiveness really does enrich a society, because one thing is an absolute fact is we're all going to fall over at some point and do something that we regret doing, you know, whether that be in your marriage or whatever that may be. So I think vitality as well, and you know, there's some key words about what makes a place work, but understanding that life isn't a one-size-fits-all, building things just for the masses and putting you all in the same box. I think more and more we see in society is that, you know, it's okay to be a little bit different. You know, when we were growing up, it was very much like if you were a bit different, you'd just get teased at school and you were off. And it's actually probably cooler to be different now than it is to be the norm. And it's just, you know, things are evolving and changing. And I think having a place to where it's okay to do that. But yeah, faithful. I mean, I give my life to God. It's ironic I should be in another church doing a talk, but that's what got me clean from 10 years of cocaine addiction, gambling addiction, chaos, and you know, that led to the crimes and the mess that I was in. I had to get a lot of understanding and forgiveness in my life. So I think all of those things for me is just being a good soldier alongside people, and you know, I think there is more of an understanding for that out there. But yeah, that resonates obviously with the work that we're doing and getting alongside people and loving them and all of that stuff. It all sounds, it's not a boardroom speech, is it? But actually it's becoming a little bit more boardroom speech. I think you're leaning towards ESG in some of the descriptives of what you're doing, and it's quite a big thing. It's actually unavoidable for the corporate world, whether they like it or not. There's got to have some, depending what country they would be in, some measure of heart, really. You know, so by hook or crook, they're having to turn their minds to it. So the boardrooms may be more welcome, less spreadsheets and more love, I reckon, Riccardo, which is always what I wanted to be called, Riccardo. I'm so quite jealous. Jealousy is not something we should have in society, but I am jealous of his tan and his name. Just getting that out there for everyone now.
Okay, thank you. Tom, let me come back to you, because the whole theme today is about regeneration, and I was struck by your introduction when you said, I saw things closing one by one. And so do you do nothing? And in the context of what, you know, Riccardo and Richard have said, tell me about, you know, the importance of regeneration for you in that context, and the contribution, because social enterprises don't work in silos. You know, they need those large corporations, because those large corporations are also the supply chains. You know, they are also the architects of the buildings that we reside in. So tell me something about, I guess, that endeavour from a social enterprise perspective and its contribution to reimagining the city, but also in terms of regeneration.
100%. I mean, to me, regeneration is all about place, and it ties in directly with what Riccardo and Richard have just said there about that being centred around people. And ultimately, you know, with Spark, we had the almost luxury of designing the space from the ground up. Really, it was we're on what was a disused site on Piccadilly. You know, disused for over 20 years, and we were able to go onto that site as a vacant bit of land and design with shipping containers where, you know, how the space would be used and what it would look like and all those kind of things. And I think through people's involvement, I think that's how you want to try and create some identity ultimately for a place, and then ultimately association and attachment. And that's, I think, some of the emotional points, to extend what the guys are saying there, that's what you're looking for in terms of how people view place. I suppose, you know, little examples and ways that we do that. You know, we work with lots of individual businesses that lease units for us in the containers, and we really encourage them, for example, to sort of decorate and design the units as they see fit. It shouldn't be about sort of prescriptive direction on, you know, the similar schemes made from containers across the country that might be all black and need to look a certain way, and it's about the overall design of that. I think we try and encourage expression within our place, and I think that's how we try and build that feeling of identity and attachment, and ultimately involvement from people, that it's not you know, this needs to be a certain way, and there's no shift, there's no bend in there. It needs to be flexible and adaptable and be able to, similar to the whole theory of regeneration. I think what Charlie mentioned in the first session about cities constantly evolving, we take that approach with our small space on Piccadilly. That should constantly evolve, it should change. It's great when people visit the space, friends that might come once or twice a year and go, oh my God, it's changed so much since I was last here. That's like a mark of success for us. Yeah, and I think that's really like the root of what we try and achieve there with regards to place.
Great. Let me pick up, Tom, on that theme. And Stephen, you know, Tom, Riccardo, Richard have talked about, you know, partnerships, engagement. But that's not easy, you know. So we're making it sound, you know, idealistic. You know, wouldn't it be great if it was that simple? I'd like to hear a bit about the backstory of why a social enterprise and not just a small and medium-sized enterprise. So what is it about social enterprises in terms of that regional contribution, you know, from your perspective?
So I have the privilege of doing my dream job, and that's working with really passionate people with really good ideas, and trying to work with other really passionate people about trying to bring that thing together and bring it to another level of change. And I think where the social side of enterprise comes in is that it embeds people in that process centrally, and it starts and ends with people and problems around the environment. And I think one of the things that like the economies that we've worked in, like small and medium-sized enterprises are the engines for growth for most countries, but there's something about social enterprises that add extra value to the work that they're doing, that either they're place-based, they're mission-focused, they're impact-focused. And when you look at the research, you see that a lot of social enterprises are delivering innovative products and services that channel change and contribute change. You see society Googling things around where does my thing come from, or sustainable goods and services. And so there's this kind of convergence around we need to steward what we have better. And I think the value of social enterprise gives us a platform and an entry point into where we can foster that transition into an economy of justice, of equity, of sustainability, of change. And I think what's really important for that process is that social enterprises particularly, like there's that really butchered adage, I'm going to butcher it now, but change moves at the speed of trust. And everything that we do as people, it relates to relationship and connection. And I think when you put social before commerce, something different comes out of that value, and it's a lot more beyond just the bottom line.
Okay, but are they either ors, or are they compatible bedfellows?
They are compatible, I believe. I think that there is a unique space for social enterprises that are very mission-driven, and they adopt that risk. That by virtue of sort of clean slate solutions, they're taking on the risk of change into their mission. And I think that social enterprises are frontier business and market frontier creators. They take on that risk. They take on that challenge to create a market for that change to happen and find a marketable solution for that problem. But I also think that enterprises generally, like, I don't know an enterprise now that's not thinking about impact. We are so far into that process that I think every business owner has probably at least thought, what is impact for me? Mm-hmm. And I think that there is that convergence now, and that really sweet spot is coming to play where social enterprises and enterprises that are becoming more mindful of impact can work closer together. And I think there is, as we go on week by week, there's more synergies, more partnerships, more opportunities that are coming to that.
Okay, Riccardo, one more before I open it up, because I know there'll be lots of questions from the audience. I've been struck by the panel, when you talk about equity, and you talk about an equality of opportunity, and we talk about social purpose. And I know when, Charlie Jeffries, the Vice-Chancellor, that you heard earlier on this morning, one of the big visions that he set for us as a university was a university of public good. The spaces that we did, the work that we do, all had to have a purpose. So in terms of design and architecture, how do we bring those things together in terms of social purpose, equity, people?
Well, again, it's about value chain and value system. And unfortunately, my experience of regeneration, and I worked for 2 UK cities for many years as a city officer, you have an area that needs regenerated in the first place, which is, like a feeling of something. But then you put a lot of effort into various mechanisms, financial, social, or whatever, to regenerate the area. The minute you start being successful, the multiples, the banks, and people move in to take advantage of the value, the real value that's been created, and they sterilise it. And then they move on. And then what happens, it's like arts-related regeneration, which in the 80s was something that I was involved in thinking about when I worked for the City of Edinburgh. And yeah, it's great to have a bunch of artists, but I did a series of workshops with artists to try and define what they wanted. And the last thing they wanted was an arts quarter. The last thing they wanted was a building that said, here lives artists. They just wanted cheap rent, sustainable cheap rent. The minute they move in and they create a buzz, East End of London, I'm sure here, then the investors start looking at it differently because they can extract more profit. And that's the issue, it's the extraction of value that then kills the goose that laid the golden eggs. Because we've totally inverted what place is about. Your focus is about people. A bank doesn't think about people. A big investor doesn't think about people. And it used to be greenwash, now it's ESG wash. I mean, I do work across the world, and you get a bunch of people that have read the stuff and will say the right words, and they don't mean one bit of it. And they will pay to put, it used to be social conscious. There's projects that big entities will do to, not to make them feel good because they don't actually care, it's just to tick the box. So we need to change the thing in a systemic way. And that's about education.
It's a legacy. Sorry to just jump in, but it's the legacy beyond, what you're talking about is a city changing and investment and banks and various things. There's a lack of thought about the long term, isn't there? So the medium term is about the limit of the focus, whereas the legacy impact is beyond lifetimes, and I think people find it really hard to
I'll try and crystallise that.
It's not going to benefit them, so they're not bothered.
Grosvenor Estate is one of the wealthiest real estate companies in the UK. It's top 10 in the world. And they have a core portfolio that they will never get rid of, which is Belgravia. It's the centre of London. The Duke of Westminster, every 125 years, becomes wealthier because they're very, very clever, and they've looked after their asset. And when I used to work with a Danish company called Gale Architects, and we advised them. And it's a monster, but it does some really good things because it does look after the fabric of that area. And I remember the chief executive at the time was a chap called Peter Vernon, talking to him about the fact that by doing some of the things that they were doing, they were sterilising what made some of these bits of London really good. And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you need a cobbler. You need the guy that fixes your TV. You need the person that may wash your underwear. All of these kind of things. You're pricing them out the market. Okay, yeah, we can get them delivered or whatever, but it's so much nicer when you can walk to the cobbler that you may talk about the football match or whatever, and he fixes your shoes. And there's another byproduct of that. He's fixing your shoe. You're not throwing your shoe away. So all of these things are this kind of social tissue. Now, from my point of view, it's about creating a granular environment where you have small units, not big, large floor plates. And Peter's a very clever man, and he kind of went, you may have a point, but the spreadsheet is what controls what it does. But because they're so profitable, they were able to start introducing these small concessions, which they would just really, it's like, let an artist or a potter use one of your shop windows. It will attract interest. Yeah. And you need some of that kind of glue, but it needs to be in perpetuity. Because then that gives a job to somebody. And that, there's that kind of different chain of values, which is critically important.
And it's vital because actually York and the region around York and the city of York really lends itself to that. We've got an incredible project called Street Life on Cooney Street where, lots of shops shutting down. And it's created incredible vibrancy of richness of learning in the way that you've been articulated. So, when we work together with the developers, with the architects, with the planners, and with those businesses, creativity can make an incredible difference. I could ask questions all day long, and I know the audience have been patiently sitting on their hand and said, we're here. And so, let me open it up. So again, if you'd like to ask a question, if you could just raise your hand, and I'll take a couple at a time. Phil.
I'll stop shouting now in that case. Question which comes from the fact that about thinking about how you design place and what needs to be there. And this comes from background that I've had recently doing public engagement in the city. When we did the public engagement for the New York Central development, we condensed the public vision that came out of that down to what we called 8 big ideas. One of those 8 big ideas was the idea of a community made through exchange. This idea about place being not the quality of the paving or the world-class architecture or the iconic buildings, but what went on there and what people did together. So I'd very much agree with Riccardo that place is about people, but it's about what people do together. And that as part of that, what we need to do as designers in the broader sense is think about how we create economy, how we create understanding for that to happen. So I suppose my question is about how do you create that kind of structure, whether it's about economy or physical place, which enables a community made through exchange to happen.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Yeah, thank you. Just over here. Mike's just coming your way.
Good afternoon. My point is, just to give you the point I'm coming from, I live in what is laughingly called York's Notting Hill. And you've talked about regeneration and it being a failure, having to regenerate something, which I sympathise with. But I think regeneration for the last few years has actually become, rather than regenerating something, you gentrify it. And that in itself then prices the people who would, and like I say, I remember, I'm not a native of York, but I came to York first in 1982, and Bishey Road was not a nice place to visit. Now it's York's Notting Hill, although there are no second-hand bookshops. There are lots of food outlets. But what do you think? People talk of regeneration, particularly politicians, do they really mean gentrification, in which case that has a huge knock-on effect on the local economy?
Great, thank you. It reminded me, Riccardo, of your earlier link to the East End of London. I grew up in the East End of London, and it certainly doesn't look like the East End of London that I grew up in. But that doesn't mean to say that we don't regenerate in the way that you've just articulated. So let me ask all of the panellists, and I'll come to you individually in terms of responses and your reflections on each of those questions. Tom, let me come to you first.
Yeah, so I think that one of the core themes from today in regeneration generally, and it was discussed in the first panel there, and Riccardo mentioned about like decisions made at boardroom level and spreadsheets versus people. There seems to be like representation for the people-centric focus in that argument, and it's a fairly accepted one, which is a good thing. Then there's also, the first section there was a discussion around, understanding what the private sector and private capital needs from regeneration. And to me, straight away, you've got two very different ideas at that point. One of those has to take a priority to become the leading theme and to become the thing that defines how that regeneration works. I don't think they can work, with both of those ideas being dominant, because I think that's why we're facing so many issues locally and globally now that we do with economies across the world. So, York Central's the local example, and it came up a bit more in the first panel, but I think that's a real opportunity for the stakeholders of York to decide whether that is profit-focused or people-centric, because they're two really, really different things. And it's nice to dress them up in great documents where you can cover both of those things, but they're very different. And being clear and bold about what that vision is, I think, is ultimately going to define the outcome.
Great, thank you. Richard, thoughts, reflections?
Yeah, just I know York personally really well. My granddad used to live here, and my dad's from Heworth, and obviously most of you'll know Heworth. And I know that there is, and I follow York, it's in my heart, I can't help it. Even my dad's a York City supporter, which is embarrassing probably to say in some sense and not in others, but so I know I know that there is some great will here for change, and I keep my eyes on York, and knowing a good York man as my dad is, then I also know that there will be some vehement opposition for things that want to change, and regeneration and retrospectively trying to change communities is, you've got to realise it's not going to happen 100% all of the in the ways that you want it to happen. You're just going to have to fit in the cracks, but what I think more than anything, for me, is just that joined up thinking, and I do see some brilliant stuff going on, in here in York, and some great people leading the charge for it, and they probably won't stop either, and things like the LEP and various other initiatives that are going on here to pull York together. It's so fragmented, it's almost like the Caribbean in some ways, there's so many different islands, trying to pull everyone together. We're part of Greater York, we're Inner York, with the district, with this, with that, the council. I live in Teesside, it's exactly the same. We've got a mayor for this and a mayor for that, and nobody knows what the heck's going on anyway. So, you have got a lot to contend with. So this fanciful idea that it's going to regenerate this or that, with the greed that's around as well, I think there's got to be a little bit of slightly different thinking around it all, and wording. I think regeneration is an old word that actually I think has failed a lot in certain areas. We hear it in Teesside every week, about this is happening, that's happening, but it's but joined up thinking is required, but the desire is out there for it for sure. These people are here obviously for
Stephen,
those reasons.
Kind of your reflections, and particularly on that question that was raised between regeneration, that actually regeneration means that you price people out. So thoughts and reflections.
So in terms of, I'm going to try and dovetail both questions, because I also really like Phil's question, and that's probably definitely got a lot more to say on that. That microphone wouldn't take. But we do a lot of work around like how do you build spaces for social enterprise to thrive and to solve problems. And there's this word that's come up in that space over the last couple of decades around ecosystems. Like, what does an ecosystem look like? What does an ecosystem mean? We borrow from like biomimicry ideas of symbiotic relationships. And I think actually what we are not getting right as institutional ways of working to create ecosystems is understanding how we are all connected and what do those connections look like, how strong are those connections, and what value is being created within them. And I think when we go through peaks and troughs with economic change, resilience of how strong those connections are able to absorb those impacts are where some of the breakdowns in societal issues can evolve. And I think community resilience is a really powerful thing. And I think one of the things that we've looked at in sort of how do you build those ecosystems is not just seeing change, social impact as an output or as a product of it. It's a process. It's embodying the values, embodying the principles that then create the North Star for evolving those ecosystems together. And I think, speaking on Phil's part, one of the things that's often a challenge in our spaces is profit versus people, and often that trade-off of how efficiently can we solve a problem often cuts off the fat of the redundancies of community resilience that often don't then allow us to solve our problems collectively. And there's this idea in sort of when you build an ecosystem of change, you want to foster those spaces of redundancy. You want to create the community hubs. You want to foster projects that embody citizenship and voice. And you want to also decentralize the connections of lead institutions. You want to try and decentralize just the dependency of one or two large organizations and distribute that as effectively as possible. And I think when we try to think about regeneration, we have to think about how are we managing that ecosystem as everyone involved there, and how well are we embedding those principles of resilience in the ecosystem and that way of working to enable change to happen and be sustainable.
Great, thank you. Riccardo, I was struck by both the question of the panelist and a song that, or the words of a song that Joan introduced me to not so long ago, struck a chord with me, and it was from, There's a Crack. It was a Leonard Cohen song, There's a Crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. And I was thinking about, the responses. So what would your reflections be to those questions about how we let that light in, in a way that really does shine a light, both in a positive sense, but also it challenges us, as we've heard, from the panellists?
It's regeneration is gentrification, unfortunately, all over the world. And you'll get politicians and architects and other people saying otherwise. It isn't. Because all you're looking at, your real estate value going up, what you should be doing is reinvesting that into the community infrastructure. And you need rules and regulations. I don't know why I'm saying this, but you need rules and regulations to protect tenure. Because otherwise what happens is total sterilisation. Central of London, centre of New York, Paris, all of these places are in a fantastic upward spiral if you're an investor. But actually, if you live there, okay, you can have enough money to have the maid that lives with you. But most of the people that live in these cities are having difficulties in getting basically the basic services to maintain their quality of life there. They're going to price that out because if somebody has to commute 5 hours to go, get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, pay money to go and clean somebody's toilet. During Boris Johnson's stint as mayor, for some reason I ended up in a mayoral community on housing. And I used a very simple example because I knew the deputy mayor who was responsible, a guy called Daniel Molyans. And I said, when Rosa, your maid, can't come and clean your toilet anymore, what are you going to do? And the penny dropped. He actually realised that they needed to start making provision for the little slave. Now, I would not phrase it that way, but a good place is a place where there's mixed tenure and it's heterogeneous. everybody of any social background, what Jan Gehl says, public space is should be the most democratic thing. The minute you ghettoise it, you privatise it, it doesn't work anymore. So regeneration, we need to, call it a spade, is can you say that anymore? I don't know. Is getting the value curve to go up, but you then need to have something, whether it's to protect the ecosystem. And it should not be bureaucratic, it should be flexible and responsive, which makes it really difficult because change is something that bureaucracies and humans don't like. We like doing the same thing over and over again, and that's why we end up with such big problems. But you need a layer of protection. If you leave it to the free market, it just screws it all up.
Great, thank you. Really, really great responses. I knew there's going to be a flurry of hands that are going to come up. So I'm going to take a couple. And I'm just going, as I saw the female just behind me.
Hi, I'm Lauren. I'm part of the Youth Futures Foundation What Works Centre for Meaningful Youth Employment. The question might be more towards Stephen, but I'd like to get all your opinions on how we can convince the big spreadsheet-oriented businesses that Riccardo touched on that the social enterprises, the employing vulnerable groups, is actually researched and empirically proven to be beneficial, to be needed, and to work. I'd love to get your opinions on that.
Great, thank you, Lauren. We'll take the question at the front here. Just over here. Thank you. And then we're going to go to Sam.
Riccardo made a good point. You made one or two good points, actually. There used to be a place called Oggy's Pond. It was, the locals used to call it Oggy's Pond. People used to go around. It's owned by Birches. It's drink houses, right? And I went on, there used to be a nice little train go right round as well. As a kid, I used to like that. And then it went private, and a Pakistani bought it. Nothing against Pakistanis, but he bought it, and it's closed. You can't go down. There's another pond just on the other side, it's not half as good. So the people lost that, you see. You mentioned a point, didn't you, about losing things like that. Okay.
Great, thank you. Sam.
Thanks, everyone. I'd like to try and stop this relentless march towards sterilisation and this sort of horrible sort of anti-utopian image that you've all painted in front of you, and paint social enterprise as part of the sort of tonic in sort of solving that, and one of the ways of engendering this sort of community drive against that sort of position, if you like. But I think one of the things that's really important to us is we should all be working together about it. We should all be trying to work with the private sector, with the large institutions, with the anchor institutions, to try and solve these problems collectively. And I'm really interested in the panel's opinions from all of your experiences around how we can do that, how we can drive that collectivism to try and solve these issues. And I'm really keen on the social enterprise perspective as well, because we've seen and we've been working through the university and part of a coalition across the city with some frankly remarkable social enterprises. And I'm really keen to how we can collectively tell their stories and sort of make more about the sort of social enterprise activity that's being done across the city with a view to improving the city and the regeneration conversation.
Great, thank you, Sam. So, Stephen, let me come to you first with Lauren's question.
Sure. So, how do we convince businesses that employing marginalised people in the labour market are actually good for business? I think you'll also probably have something to say on this. And I think one of the things that I'm a big firm believer in is that people who have big businesses and have the ability to employ, they want to employ people and they want to be able to offer jobs for people in the most meaningful way. I'm a firm believer in that. If I'm wrong, then I'm not in the right job. And I think one of the things that we have to challenge in this sort of commercial mindset of who and how do we employ is around the risk appetite and who pays for that. And I think a lot of the employment narrative around employing people with that require additional support is the cost of that, and then the management and maintenance of that. And I think one of the biggest things that we've seen in the work that we do is that if you can get the employer and you can get the people in the room together with others who are all wanting to try and solve that problem together, there is always a solution. It's not a question of, is it good for business? It is business, because people who are in the labour market are productive and are a valuable asset to themselves and to people. And I think one of the sort of ideas that we have is we take a very youth-centred approach to working on employment challenges with people. We in a previous, before Cassis, I was working as a research consultant on some strategies for youth employment in a couple of African countries, and we were like, what's the problem in the market? What are the fundamental problems in this market that stop this market from being productive, that stop it from being profitable, that are preventing unlocking value? And then identifying ways in which young people can play a part in that, and coming together with a coalition of the willing, borrowing Sam's phrase for that, to identify investment packages that can help create more opportunities for young people that deliberately tackle specific structural barriers to opening up value for the businesses themselves. And I think if you can bring people to the table with that idea of saying, how can we find a commercial solution to this problem, the biases and the stigmas often are the last thing that we end up talking about, because everyone's like, okay, this is great.
Thank you. Richard, if I come to you specifically with Lauren's question, because you're doing it, maybe sort of in a couple of sentences, the importance of that and how you've done that.
Yeah, great question, and it's obviously pertinent to what we do. But I think it's evidence in the success of it, and actually a lot what I've realised on the first foray into this, into this world that I'm in now, it was just to knock on some doors and ask employers, would you be willing, if we can vet somebody and put them through a process where we can vouch for them and put them forward, would you be willing to hire an ex-offender? So many of those employers said, yeah, we've never had anybody knock on our door and ask us directly that question. They may have had an email from someone nervously asking before or whatever, or something. But so what we did is essentially just one foot in front of the other, get one person, use their success, story, if you like, a testimonial, and what you find is certainly in areas such as York or Teesside, the business community is quite rich and quite big, but it's also quite small in terms of who knows who, and and we started to get brands on board with us and essentially put out the feeling of risk involved in it all when others are putting themselves to us. But video evidence, in a boardroom, is a video testimonial of the money that you gave this charity through corporate support last year. Here's Dave's story, Put Big Dave on a video. Some people in this room have seen Big Dave's video. I know they're nodding. It's an amazing story of a life turned around, and it's actually, I use my own example when I go and speak to them, because at the end of the meeting I'll say, by the way, I'm still an unspent conviction sat here. So and it's like, not everybody is what I thought they were in prison, etc. Can I just read out something, which I will finish on this. You did say a couple of lines, but the people that we're working with, this is not directly from Clean Slate Solutions, but it's from somebody who works in the justice sector. So I just wanted to highlight the people in the system, and it is relevant to the question. So out of 10 new prisoners inducted today, 3 will have been care leavers, 5 will have been abused as a child, 5 will have witnessed violence in the home as a child. Most will have fragmented education, 5 will have had no qualifications, 7 or 8 won't have been employed prior to prison, 2 will have come in homeless, 2 or 3 will have psychosis, 5 will suffer anxiety and depression, and up to half will have previously attempted suicide. Now, that's not just a snapshot of prisons, actually. If you go out there, you ask most people, the deepest, rootest core truth that you're going to get out of somebody, there's a lot of that going on in this room. I'm sure people in this mindset, this anxiety, depression, whatever it is, but it just gives you an idea of the multiple barriers that some people have. But it still doesn't mean that someone can't get alongside them, love them, care for them, cheer them on, which is what we're doing as well. We're giving hope, cheering them on, holding their hand. You can do it. and the employer actually wants to engage with that as well, then you've got something to work with. So the employer would have a mentor at their end. You'll see it a lot in the corporate world now. You have to have mental health, like first aiders. So you have mental health first aiders now in a lot of businesses, and so that recognition of it all. So it's quite a grim snapshot of 10 people going into prison today, but that's the reality of what we find.
Great, thank you. Riccardo and Tom, if I can come to you, particularly around Sam's question now, around this notion of collectivism, common purpose, that collective spirit, your thoughts and reflections in response to Sam.
It's really, to me, fascinating that, the work you guys are doing is very good. It's how it's quantified by the people that allow that work to happen. You have to fill a form in, ask for a bid, and then somebody takes a value judgment how you're going to perform. And that's not sustainable, right? That's just like chicken feed. And the other thing is, it's episodic. It happens. Or there's a government program, or there's a local authority program, or there is some agency's program, and they throw some money at it. And that's just going to, that's like being subsidy junkies. That's not a solution to anything. I'll use an example which is parallel but totally different. In Denmark, they've been incredibly successful at creating healthy places, people-centered places. Not everywhere, but so they have lots of people that are using active travel, active movement. That has had a direct impact on health expenditure at government level. So the silos that control budgets, somebody basically said, right, the health system is saving money because people are cycling. So we take money from this budget and we put it to create more cycle lanes, more people-centred places. Now, could you imagine going down to Whitehall and saying to one of the ministries, you're going to have to surrender some of your budget to that? You'll have ministers killing each other, whether they're green, white, yellow, whatever party, because the system that we have is adversarial. I'm a minister, I have a department, I have a budget. I will protect it. A local authority functions in the exact same way. Now, moving to mayoral system may help, because then you have a person that can actually decide how the football team's working. But again, a senior politician gets fed a whole load of information that's skewed because it's all about numbers. Smiles don't win things. A smiling baby at an election campaign might, but I'd like to see as an output is how many smiles in that street. We've got facial recognition camera. Let's look at for good things. There's happy people here. Whether high or not, they're happy. And it's again, the older I get, the more radical I'm becoming. We have a corrupt value system. We have value system that drives what we have. And that is, in education, in medicine, in everything. I'm going to say something very controversial in terms of the university. Why is the university work out on a campus? That is, in principle, a failed decision. A decision that takes life out of a city. Simple. It was made a long time ago. You can change things. And it's not only about that. Hospitals. To be efficient, hospitals have to be built in greenfield sites. You break a leg, you've got to hop there. It's just a crazy way we look at the world.
Thank you. I mean, those, and we'll come back to a couple of things that you've said there. Tom, any final reflections on collectivism? Then I'm going to take my last set of questions.
I just wanted to focus on the second half of Lauren's question, which was about encouraging institutions that social enterprise works, and I think that links into Sam's question as well. And basically just echoing what the guys have said in terms of reporting and impact reporting, that's really important. And there is a constant battle of numbers of trying to prove your worth and prove that a slightly alternative system can work. One of our key stats, for example, with Spark is monitoring the amount of businesses that start with us and then move into a permanent premises, which is ultimately about trying to offer that next step beyond early incubation into a city centre unit, for example, that then brings that life and that sort of locally driven change through to a more permanent situation, because we're only very temporary as a project. At the minute we have a lease until next November. So as we're looking at expansion, as it were, or if we can't exist in York anymore, if we look at another city in the north where we feel we could make a difference, that is the constant root of the conversation. It's like, what impact is going to come from this? How do you prove that this social enterprise model is any better than the more traditional model? And it is a battle, a constant battle, to try and evidence that case. But I think that's the root of it. It's proving that a different system can work and can bring real benefits, and the legacy of that as well. Not about the direct action within that project in our case, but the impact that can have on a wider city. And if we're serious about changing city centres from being a sterile place, the university point is an interesting one. I remember a stat when we were first sort of going around speaking to universities and other institutions in York, when we were sort of talking about the idea of Spark. And this stat may not be accurate now, so please pull me up on it if it's not, Charlie. But I believe the graduate retention rate in York was about 8%. And you compare that to a place like Liverpool, which I remember at the time was 50%. Now that tells like a story of talent and creativity and energy staying in the city or not. And that might have changed. I'm sure there's work going on to solve that particular problem. And it was something that me and Sam were both really sort of driven by, really, as a statistic, because we're both from here and studied elsewhere and came back and didn't want to, do the typical thing of moving to London or to Manchester or to a bigger place. And that was something that's really stark for us. So I think, evidencing that change and making that a real focus of whatever it is, whether it's a business or a project or an idea, that's a really important part of it. It feels a shame sometimes to constantly have to prove your worth and constantly evidence that, but it is an unfortunate part of trying to make that change. And to get people to sit up and listen, you need to prove with results that a different way is possible and could challenge the status quo.
No, thank you. And I think that's a really important provocation to the debate. Charlie, I'm just going to bring you in before I take the next set of questions, because
sorry, Charlie.
I know that you've been instrumental in the university working really hard to make sure that we have a city centre presence, but also how we retain that graduate talent in the city. And Charlie, you talked about it earlier on, and we've got some new audiences, particularly about issues around providing homes and houses in order for them to stay. So they don't leave because they want to, but we've got to have the right skills and the right jobs as part of that. So before I take any more questions, Charlie, do you want to just, sort of maybe pick up and reinforce the point you made earlier on, because I thought it was a really important one.
Thanks, Kieran. I think that the figure you quoted is way out of date. Good. I think there's a much bigger proportion of our students who remain in the city and or nearby, and that's, as far as I recall, don't hold me to this, I think it's not far off 50% in the region. Not just the city, which I think is...
Yeah, that was 2016-17 that number was around, so I'm glad that's changed so dramatically.
There is... Sorry, I'm Charlie Jeffrey, Vice-Chancellor of the University of York. There is a drag on that. Well, I think there's probably two drags. One is that we need to work hard to transform the economy of the city into one which provides the kinds of jobs that more graduates would wish to do. Yeah. I said in the earlier session, I think we're too dependent on the visitor economy in this city, which doesn't typically have that many high added value jobs that graduates would want to go on to do it for anything more than the short term. The other problem is housing. Housing costs. Housing costs in this city are very high. There is a shortage of lower cost housing, which has a number of drivers, which we talked about earlier. But unless we tackle that, it's not just graduates, it's families, people who have kids and find they need somewhere bigger to live, and it's really, really difficult. It's the same for lower earners at the university, non-academics typically. Again, how do you manage in a city which has a real shortage of affordable housing? I was asked at the end of the last meeting what miracle I would like for this city, and that miracle is to have low-cost housing which remains low-cost housing and isn't flogged off or turned into Airbnbs at much greater volumes than we have now. And that would be, in a sense, a magical solution to some of those challenges about retaining even more graduate talent in the city. Apologies, Kieran, I banged on for a bit.
No, thank you, Charlie. I think that's really important because the whole purpose of publication is debate is also to say, what are we doing about it, rather than just raising those kind of questions. I want to go back to Helena. Thank you. And then if there's any other questions, if you could raise your hand, brilliant, and I'll come through to the two at the back there.
It's been absolutely fascinating, thank you. And yes, I think we should love the Earth a lot more. We should ask the Earth, does it want to be built there? Is this the best place? We need to do a lot more getting back in touch with how we used to use the world and build in the right places. And that automatically then attracts good stuff. Anyway, that aside. I was reminded of the words of Rag and Bone Man, which is, don't put the blame on me. And I think that's something that we have around, that it's not my fault, I can't do anything about it. And I put the challenge out to the group earlier. What is it that we can do now? What action can we take to help change? Because the community, it's not just, we don't need an ocean, we need all the little drops, all the little raindrops that will create that ocean, and we can do it. And the question or the invitation I have to the panel is, how could you inspire us to go out and take that action? I'm definitely an action person.
Great, thank you. Hold that, panel, because I'm going to come to each of you in a second to respond to that. But I want to take those two questions at the back. Thank you.
Thank you. I introduced myself earlier to Charlie. I've studied in York and I live in York. And I want to ask a question. I'll be perfectly accepting if you tell me this is beside the point. I don't think it is, so I'll ask it anyway. I've become very fascinated by the idea of the universal basic income. And some of it horrifies me and some of it I can get on board with. And I just haven't made up my mind where I feel about this. But listening to Richard's story of redemption, Riccardo's story of sometimes lamenting his own prostitution in the professional world, and some of the things that Tom has said, is there something to be said for it in terms of urban regeneration and values within urban regeneration? If you've got an industrialist oligarch like Elon Musk actually advocating for this and saying, well, you know, the thing is it'll make people more creative and less afraid to go out and be creative in terms of changing the world. Is there something to be said for it?
Thank you. Great question. And there was another hand up just behind you. Thank you.
So I've heard a lot of talk about growth, but the problem with climate change in the future is that new builds about 70% more carbon than refurbishment. So a lot of this growth is really going to have to come, if it's sustainable, from the existing housing stocks and things like Spark, which are making new takes on existing space. But, I mean, do you think that space exists? Is there enough projects in York that could provide the capacity that people want to see without creating a carbon deficit?
Great, thank you. Panel, I'm going to take these two questions first, and Hannah, you're at the end, because I think it's a nice note, you know, to conclude the panel on. So, Stephen, let me come to you first.
So I don't know if I can comment so much on the sort of urban housing side, but on the UBI stuff, I suppose the debate that I understand UBI around is also to do with just meeting basic needs and what are the needs that are not being met that need to be met through UBI. And I think social enterprise, I'm going to answer it in a little bit of a flip back on to it, because I think we're quite far off from UBI, but I think social enterprise can play a really important point in demonstrating how services can be met and needs can be met. And I think one of the things that we've seen imminently in sort of the last few years is how social enterprises is plugging the gap of a lot of infrastructure and a lot of services that are being needed. We spoke earlier in the panel, I think Joanna talked about universal basic needs being met. And there's a role there for social enterprise in addressing those needs, whether it be transport, whether it be health, whether it be food or well-being. And I think we really need to take stock of the opportunity that is before us to say, what's the future that we want? and what's that going to cost us, and how do we get there? And tailoring that with Sam's question is also like, we already know that social enterprise is commercially viable for a lot of these services, and we already know that there are entry points into delivering those services. And we know the private sector who want to transition can partner in a new way to deliver those services more efficiently and effectively. And I think we need to look, firstly, before we talk about UBI, we also need to talk about like, what is the system that is going to actually deliver the needs that we are banging on about here today? And I think social enterprise is a fundamental part of that dialogue. And I would love to see that conversation evolve more around what are the services that social enterprise can meet in that space, and what are the examples that we could champion to get closer to that.
Okay, Tom, anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, I think there's like the UBI stuff is super interesting. It's fascinating learning about it and seeing studies of it, and it seems to work really well in some places. There's some studies that have shown it hasn't worked so well, but it's an idea in a formative stage, and to get a whole national economy to that sort of level, it is a huge change that will take a long time. I think the steps in between that can be helpful in getting people there and supporting that ecosystem that Stephen was talking about before, things like the 4-day working week. And ultimately, if we're talking about being people-centric in things like regeneration and building and design, I think that's it's only reasonable to look at it in employment terms as well, because that's such a huge part of everyone's lives. So I think it's probably like, as Stephen was getting to there, like a bit of a roadmap that steps out a realistic plan for that level of change, while probably government on a national level providing incentives to trial ideas like that in practice, because at the minute, it's they're so such interesting theories that we all want to learn more about. But I think similar to what we were talking about before about impact reporting, improving the case for change, it's really important that these trials can happen and be supported, and there's enough spotlight on them, because I think without that and seeing results in our settings on a local level, national level, regional level, they might stay as ideas, which would be a crying shame, because there's probably there's certainly stuff to explore within those ideas that could be fundamentally defining for the sort of change we all want, I think.
Great, thank you. I want to come back to the final question then and ask each of you, what's the one thing that you would say to the audience here and to each and every one of us that we could go away and do to make at least some difference?
No pressure.
Richard, it's the exam question that nobody wants.
I've been sat here just listening to those guys, but also in the back of my mind going, I'm going to answer that one. Never give up. I don't know.
Maybe the way to ask that question is, what's the one thing that you have done that's made that measurable difference?
I think, just voicing it's very, very easy, isn't it, to sit and think, my idea, isn't going to get momentum. But actually all that happened was I spoke to some people, good people around me, and they give me some good advice, and then I took it a bit further and asked them if they'd support me. And this building actually makes me think of the olden days, like when we used to vote on something that we knew would happen, and politicians weren't just in for 3 months and then gone. How many justice secretaries I've seen in 4 years? I've seen 6, I think. It's ridiculous. I mean, nothing gets done because nothing's, we're the only permanent thing out there. So I think just getting people, communities together in a space like this, rabble-rousing, call it whatever you want, but call into account the politicians if necessary, but also getting their support, and the universities and everybody coming together. But it starts with that one idea for change, and that's what it was with me. And to be honest with you, I just feel blessed to be in this company and doing what I'm doing now. I mean, sat in a prison cell, there was a lot of different mindset going on at that point. But, glory to God, here I am. So and pray about it. I would say, who asks for miracles? You're in the right place, brother. Come on, let's get on that. Let's get on our knees, You're in the right place. I'll pray for you.
Thank you, Richard. But I also want to give Richard a shout out, because, when we talk about change, somehow we think these are these big things, and sometimes it's in the everyday ordinaries. And Richard emailed me and said, his response back to me when I emailed him, I didn't think you were going to respond, but I thought I'd have a go. And actually, in having that go, we're going to be working together. So that's, you know, one small action that you don't know where that's going to lead to, actually has led to something really quite important. So thank you for emailing.
Can I just jump in, Sam? I know what you were saying before, and I forgot to reply to it specifically, but there is a lot of brilliant stuff going on. This is a fantastic city. Yeah, there's so many brilliant people, and it's not all doom and gloom and all sort of, you know, the world's, you know, about to crash and end. So I don't want people to think that we're all getting all bitter and twisted up here. We see amazing stuff, and, you know, some of us around the world, I'm sure, see other things, Riccardo, that we don't. And yeah, just to leave it on a high.
Stephen.
Something that, one idea, that's quite a, it's quite an ask. I would say invest in empathy. This is something that I was involved with some work with Sam last week, and I think like empathy changes everything. When you put empathy in front of a person and you channel it and you receive it, and I think empathy helps build connection, it helps build relationships, it helps build trust, it helps inspire ideas for change. And I think business has become so cold and so transactional that we've lost how to do connection well in our society, and finding how to solve our problems through business requires empathy. And I think just make sure that you carry that forward into your conversations, into anything to do with community, and you'll see a lot more change happen, I think, quickly.
Great, thank you. Tom?
I think from my experience, I completely echo what Richard and Stephen have just said there. Certainly leading with empathy and focusing on connection and being authentic in what you're doing is absolutely vital. I think from my perspective, it would be about, you know, if you've got an idea, if you're passionate about something, there's a problem that you want to solve, go out and do it and take action and, you know, start a social enterprise. If it's a more traditional business, look at what being a social enterprise means. I think the kind of accepted definition would be a market solution to a social problem. So an issue that you see in society, if you feel it's worth tackling, look at how that can be done through a business. And I think beyond that, to think of the original question from the first panel about, if you could wake up tomorrow morning and something had been changed, I think there's still more that can be done fairly quickly at a local level to encourage, thriving social enterprise, basically. Things like business rates that Joan mentioned in the first panel can be changed, reasonably at a local level to encourage social enterprise. For example, in Leeds, just down the road, business rates are discounted by 80% for social enterprises. In York, that's not the case. That feels like a fairly quick thing that could be done, in my opinion, that would encourage more people to start social enterprises, thus creating that sort of collective snowball effect of positivity and inspiring others in doing that. So I think, with changes like that, York could become this hub, this centre, through the work of Sam and Enterprise Works, could become this amazing place that does encourage social enterprise to thrive. And I think through that you would see more people there going out and taking action and realising it's possible.
Great, thank you. And Riccardo, final word to you.
What can people individually do? You can do many things. Number one is actually ask yourself the question, what kind of world do you want? What kind of city do you want? What kind of neighbourhood do you want? And when you start thinking about that, a lot will come out. I mean, in my life, I've done a lot of community consultations in various parts of the world. And when you get a bunch of people that live in an area in a room, the biggest topics are dog shit and car parking. This is global. Argentina, South Africa, it's just crazy, right? And you then have to get people to start thinking, no, I'm not talking about that. Do you want your kids to be able to play in the street? And they go, no, they can't. That's for cars. Well, there you go. What kind of world do you want? And then, one step at a time, if enough people do it, it will change. But you need to create a demand for that change. And debates and talking about it and coalescing together around specific things is the way we used to change things. With this stuff, we're controlled. I'm the only one that's got one on the table, which is really sad. But these are control mechanisms. Use your brain, talk to your neighbour, and other thing is empathy is really good, but respect as well. Because my wish and desire might be something that you absolutely abhor. And the other thing in terms of what the lady said, which is critically important for all of us, we cannot consume soil the way we are consuming soil. And that for the real estate industry is a big issue. That has a direct impact, not necessarily in York, but in larger settlements. That means densities need to go up. And densities, if they're done properly, create a demand for social enterprise for all these kind of things. Not density as we tried to do them in the 50s and 60s, which is shove a bunch of people in slab blocks and tower blocks. Real density. Barcelona actually is really quite a dense place. It's pretty good. So think and choose the kind of world you want, and then convince other people that that's the right thing.
Right, thank you. Friends, colleagues, can I finish on that note, that we leave thinking about what kinds of place and world are we creating and do we want to create? I have this phrase that says, individually we'll create change, but today I guess I'm asking for us collectively to work together to create a movement. Can I just say a huge thank you to Richard, Stephen, Tom and Riccardo. It's been a thought-provoking presentation, but actually what I have really loved most about our debate is your honesty, is your authenticity, and your clarity of purpose. That's not easy, and for that I'm immensely grateful, and for me, I've loved chairing it. To the audience, for giving up your afternoons to be here and engaging with us, because that's how, to feel, the piece that you talked about, Riccardo, it's what we take away and what we work with as a collective, because we owe that. We owe that to ourselves, and we owe that to the generations that are going to come after us. Just before I hand it over to Joan to say a final few words, can I just say a huge thank you, because this is the final York Festival Ideas. It is enjoyed by York and the city and the region and beyond. And a huge amount goes on in terms of the work that behind it, in the design and in its planning, and it's a small team led by the critical activist in the way this panel has been talking about. And that's Joan Concannon and her team. So can I ask the audience to show our appreciation to the panel and to Joan and her team for what I think for me has been an incredible York Festival of Ideas. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I've got two more thank yous to add. We were approached separately by our lovely colleagues at Aviva, and then separately we had a conversation with Sam at Enterprise Works. And we decided actually to try to meld together the aims of what both organisations wanted, which is really to the heart of the conversation we've just had, is what kind of city we want and how do we collaborate differently and better to deliver the kind of city that we all want to live in. And I think it's been a really interesting start of a conversation that I really hope we continue to have, because I think Riccardo's point around we have choices about the kind of city we want for the future, and all of you here have really contributed to that conversation. So I think it is really possible for amazing, huge organisations like Aviva, the universities, schools, colleges, and social enterprise to really shape our future in a way that could be incredibly dynamic. I'm so taken by the Danish model. It's precisely why I hounded Riccardo to come, because that idea that the thing that you really most want to measure in life is happiness is just, I think, incredibly inspiring. So the festival is a convening platform. We work with more than 100 organisations across the city, and we're so grateful to everybody who supports us. We do provide a convening platform, as Charlie said. It has been a roller coaster. 13 days, I had to count them in my head. We started on the 2nd. So thank you all so much.